Hello and welcome. My name is Rebecca Garcia and I'm the president of the Nevada Parent-Teacher Association. And I'm really excited today to be having a conversation with the Nevada Teacher of the Year, Miss Juliana Urtubey. Thank you so much for joining us today. Miss Urtubey was recently named as the Nevada Teacher of the Year and is a learning strategist at Kermit Booker Elementary in Las Vegas, Nevada. Juliana is a native of Columbia and holds a BA and an MA in bilingual general and special education elementary. She is highly accomplished. She is a national board certified teacher, on the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, a member of the Nevada Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Committee, and a Teach Plus Fellow. She is also a national board certified teacher and was recognized in 2018 as the Rogers Foundation Heart of Education winner, and in 2019 as the CPLC Esperanza Latina Teaching Award. So thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. So PTA obviously has been championing family engagement for more than 100 years. And tonight, we invited you to join me for a discussion about how we can build family educator partnerships, especially where we're sitting at in 2020, how critical that is. How can we move that conversation forward? And so I wanted to start with a very basic question. And as a teacher, why do you think it is so important to have strong relationships, not just with your students, but with their families?
Hi, Rebecca, and hi, everybody. I am very excited to be here. Family engagement is the center of everything we do in education, and so any chance that we have to partner with organizations like the PTA are celebrated in my book. So family engagement, it's the start point of education. If we think about a child's most natural teacher, it's their family, it's their community. When we think about how we're going to design our education for that child in the most holistic way, we have to always include the family and the community. That's where we're going to learn about the child's strengths, interests, goals. That's where we're going to learn about the family's strengths and interests and goals. And when we align what we teach to those strengths, a lot can happen. And we really are able to set the expectation high and even raise that expectation even higher. I think that in our educational system, families have often been marginalized or separated or removed from schools. And I've seen really beautiful things happen when we remove those barriers for all families, but particularly families who don't see themselves reflected in schools. So take your first generation Latinx families, take families that maybe don't have access to financial security or food security. When we remove those barriers, particularly for those families, we see a shift in how we interact as educators with the community, how we become part of the community versus just a place that we drive to and then back every day. Once we're integrated into that community, we understand that community, that's when we can truly appreciate the people that we serve, which are children and always their families.
Yeah. I love how many times you said the word community in there, because I think that that's been the difference I've seen as a parent when I've felt welcome and part of my kids' school is when it really does feel like a community, when it feels like you said those barriers aren't there and where there's that invitation to be part of the experience, that we're invited into the classroom, we're invited. So two kind of questions coming off of that. One, we'll table for a second, but I want to touch on how do we make this happen in this virtual world? Because obviously you and I are having a virtual conversation that we normally wouldn't, probably in a different time. And then also we're using the word family very intentionally, and that really has been an evolution in the last probably 5-10 years. I mean, it started before then, but in those conversations about family engagement, a lot of times we used to talk about parent engagement or involvement. Why do you think it matters that we're changing our word choice, that we're being conscious both as families and also as educators? Why does that matter in how we frame the discussion to be thinking about this as a family concept versus just parent?
Language matters. The way we just talk about ourselves and the way we talk about different groups of people matters. And we want to restructure the world. We have to restructure our language first. So the reason I've always used family instead of just parent is I had a dear friend in Arizona in the organizing world who adopted 2 children. And her and I would always talk about education, and she would share her frustration with the limitations of the word parent. You know, the children she adopted were old enough to understand that she was not their biological parent, but nonetheless, she was their parent. Sadly, she passed away in an accident. And so that I always just carried that with me. And I feel that when I carry that with me and I share with other people, that one of the lessons that she taught me moves forward. Family is just way more inclusive, and it's way more accurate, especially these days in virtual learning. Particularly these days in virtual learning, we have so many students who are being guided in their learning, in their virtual education, by their siblings, by uncles, by great-grandparents, by grandparents. And so, yes, a parent is crucial. Guardian is crucial to make those educational, legal considerations, but a family is always there for an education. Some families, look differently than other families. There's no right way to family. Like there's no wrong way to PTA, right?
Yeah.
And when we value all family systems, then we're really inviting a child's nurturing, or we're really nurturing a child's identity in our classrooms. And we're also opening up this idea of interdependence in education. So this idea of community again, right? So there's an educator, there's a school staff, there's the family, there's a community, and all these people are extremely vital in the development of each child's overall learning. And so when we can do all those things simultaneously, a child gets to be their truest self. When we understand that in a lot of communities, you listen to your mom the same way you listen to your tia or your auntie, or somebody who may not be blood related may still be your family member, right? We were talking about this at school the other day about how there was a family who in the definition is considered homeless or experiencing homelessness. But in the practicality of it, they're not, because they're living with a family member. And in our culture, when you live with a family member, you're not homeless. You have a home because you're sharing a home. So I think that it just blurs a lot of those barriers that people feel when we recognize and value all the people in a child's world that really makes their world grow. How do we do this? How do we have more engagement? First it was participation, right? And then I think we realized parents have so much more to offer, families have so much more to offer than just their participation. There's been so many studies about what different cultures understand as their role and responsibility in a child's education. And there's cultural variations. And through those cultural variations, when we have first generation families or even second or third generation families, we need to do a lot of dialogue, a lot of discourse about what does it mean? What do we expect as educators? What do families expect? And where can we meet in the middle? Because there's what we call mutual cultural gaps with that idea. But when we come forward with building relationships, that's something that's universal. And so for me, it's more about, it's even farther than engaging a family, right? Engaging a family might be just two-way and then it stops, right? What do we do to continuously involve and holistically plan with families, right? How do families have say in what happens in our school? How do families who historically don't have say, how do we give them say? And it's not so much of a power top-down thing. It's when we kind of plan horizontally, that's when it organically happens. That's when you have families who are able to share time, families who are able to share goods or services or knowledge, and that's when you open lots of avenues. So pre-COVID, we did this at my school by, there was a lot of different practices that were being put in place to improve our community relationship with the school community. One of the things we did was we started a garden and a mural program. Our school was not necessarily physically inviting. There's a lot of chain link fences. It's one of the older schools. And so we painted murals, and the murals were culturally responsive murals. They were Latinx artists from Los Angeles who designed their murals after talking to a group of teachers, group of students, seeing our pictures, and based on that, they designed these murals, and these murals were placed very strategically so that wherever you were around the school, you would see them. And so it screamed to families, it screamed to the community, this is your community school, you belong here, we're happy to have you here. And the same thing with the garden. The garden transformed it. We typically didn't like calling it a school garden, we liked calling it a community garden. And unfortunately, a lot of school gardens across our district at one point or another were vandalized. Our garden, in the 7 years that I was there, well, the garden was running for about 6 of the 7 years, was never vandalized. I mean, the worst we got was one time kids wrote on our whiteboard, "Stay in school, eat your vegetables."
That's a good way to target it, in a positive way. You know, as you were talking, it made me think of PTA's evolution about family engagement, because it used to be parent school, and engagement used to be that concept of involvement. Did enough parents come to open house night? Did enough families show up at the science fair? And that has evolved, and we use the term now transformative family engagement, and we have 4 I's: inclusive, individualized, integrated, and impactful. And as you were talking, I didn't give you those beforehand, but those immediately were all words that came to my mind as you were speaking, because it is, when it's inclusive and when it's focused on the different ways people can contribute. Everybody has a way to contribute to the school community, but it's not necessarily going to look the same for every family, because like you said, family structures are different, families' times are different. You know, some families can be at school helping during the school day, others are working. Or here in Nevada, not just in Southern Nevada, but you know, we have mining, we have hospitality up north, so we have a lot of families that have very different work schedules, that make that kind of traditional engagement much different. How do you think now, even though not all of Nevada is doing 100% distance, almost all schools have limited the ability of families to be on campus due to COVID restrictions? And so that has, when we talk about barriers, when we're so used to that personal contact and that's removed, but at the same time, we're more than ever, whether you're hybrid or full distance, or there are a few that are going to school full time, like the elementary, but the need for educators to be able to communicate with families is stronger than ever, I think. So how do we bridge that gap when it's such a new environment for so many of us? And again, it's one of those things where sometimes it's a abuela who has no idea what a computer is. Sometimes it's a teenage sibling who's probably great at technology, but has no patience for their younger brother or sister. So what is your advice to create those relationships when the world is so different this year?
Absolutely. I think a little bit of my nature is always to see the possibility in crisis or challenge. I think it goes a little bit to my story. And I think my story, if I share my story, I think a lot of people understand a little bit more about why I'm so passionate about family engagement and designing systems to holistically include families. So you mentioned I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and I was born in the time of heightened civil unrest. Colombia had one of the longest running civil wars in the world. And my family decided to leave Colombia because of that reason, because of the political situation. And so, you know, unlike a lot of Latinx people, my family has a different immigration story because my dad was actually born in New York. And so upon birth, that gave me dual citizenship. So even though we had clear paths, you know, once we got to Chicago, I remember just how different it was. And to keep it brief, the story I'll share is when my parents started to think about what school to enroll us in, they were disheartened to see that many of the schools had metal detectors and metal wires in the windows. And so you can see the irony in my mom leaving a war-torn country to go to an area where schools felt cold, felt unsafe. And so they were able to leverage their expertise in, my dad is a musician, and my mom studied linguistics. And so they were able to leverage those expertise. My dad taught music class, guitar class, and singing class, and my mom taught Spanish class at a bilingual magnet school that ran off of a lottery system. And they let us in because of that exchange. And so I remember hearing that story in my early adolescence, but then hearing it again recently, 5-6 years ago. And it made sense to me why I prioritized making sure that no family has to wait on leveraging their family's expertise to have a welcoming environment. So I'm very fortunate to have that story, and I recognize that privilege. And so that's why I fight and I advocate and I organize so much to be able to get that same experience for other children. In terms of the COVID world, you'll see that the schools that had relationships with families before COVID, and then you'll see the schools who weren't able to build those relationships. And those relationships are in the building, right? They're growing, and it's possible at any point, but it starts there. How does the school engage the families? How do we build relationships? You know, is there space for families to call with a question and feel welcomed with that question? I'm lucky to work at a school where our leadership is very intentional in how they design supports for families. So I'm at Kermit Booker, where we have a good amount of staff that's focused on wraparound services. I'm one of the 4 learning strategists, and so I have kind of like a hybrid role. Part of the day I co-teach with the other special education teachers, and the other part of the day I do learning strategy and coaching, but it also includes family support. So in the first couple of weeks of school, I spent maybe 2-3 hours on the phone with families. Some families just needed me to help them troubleshoot their camera. Some families, you know, really wanted me to walk them through, how do you turn on a computer? How do you charge it? How do you unlock a Chromebook? How do we update our password? And spending the time that it was necessary with each family. So some families, I was on the phone with them for about 2 hours, and that was okay. But because we had the intentional design on supporting families. So now those calls have kind of gone down because families have learned. And so I see one of the really beautiful lessons learned from this crisis as another point of access. We've given access by giving devices and the Wi-Fi hotspots through Connect Nevada Kids. We've given access to folks who didn't see themselves reflected in this digital world we're living in. Some families didn't see the need, or couldn't afford it, or just didn't see themselves reflected in having a laptop, you know, for learning purposes, for work purposes. And now they have one, and now they're able to see themselves reflected in it. We have, mostly in our younger grades and our primary grades, we have mostly senoras, moms, aunts, grandmothers who are learning a little bit of English because they're helping their student through their school. We didn't give them that access before. So to me, it's revolutionized how I see access. And I'm a person who thinks about access all the time. So I think that we start there. We start with relationships. How do we build relationships? How do we show gratitude and humility to the families who are letting us into their homes? We're guests in their homes. How do we show gratitude for all the effort the families are making to make sure kids are getting logged on and doing the best they can? How do we support the families who aren't? And so it's kind of like a 2-part answer. We need the relationships, we need the trust and the collaboration. I think right now we have mutual respect and admiration for each other, educators and families. Yeah. There's no way to get through this without it. Yeah. And the other part is, how do we design school systems to make sure that we're intentionally supporting teachers so that they can support families?
How obviously PTA includes both parents as well as educators, but I think sometimes as parents, other than kind of doing the traditional things we've been told, check your child's grades, make sure they're doing their work, how can we as families reach out to educators and better support our kids in that way? And what would be your advice for families, especially families who maybe this isn't, they didn't have the example growing up. Like I always give the example, my mom was incredibly involved in schools. I went to a lot of different schools. I moved a lot as a kid. And I went to a lot of different types. I was homeschooled, I went to private school, I went to public school, but my mom was always there. And so I just assumed that was the way it worked. And so when I became a parent, that's what I did. But that's not the same, both culturally or from the examples that different families had. So what would be your advice to families on how do we make that first step, especially in times when sometimes it feels like the teacher isn't reaching out, or we don't see that path to easily make the relationship happen?
Yes, and right now is the time to do it. You know, teachers love hearing from families. I love getting an email from past students or their families. It just brightens up my day. So I think that a lot of it starts with showing the gratitude that we feel, even if we're feeling complex feelings and things are complicated and difficult to navigate. I think we always start with gratitude, and teachers love hearing the gratitude families feel for them. So I think that's a great place to start. I always ask the families I work with, what are your goals? What do you want your child, and especially in the world of special education, what do you want your child to be able to do by the end of this year? And so if the teacher's not necessarily asking that, that information will still be valuable. So you can still offer that information. Teachers should be asking about your child's interests, preferences, goals, tips on things that they do better in. So I do better if I get to stand up and work and dance while I'm working, but I promise I'm focused. Things like that are really helpful to teachers. The other thing is, I think that the COVID crisis has really kind of shifted how I think about what we teach kids. So I think that it's shown how vulnerable our students' basic skills are, all of your foundational skills. Your ability to decode words, fluently read, comprehension while you're reading, write a paragraph or two by yourself, compute the 4 operations, solve a 2 or 3 word problem, a real world word problem where you have to decide what operation. I think that's the foundation for, like, let's say elementary, right? There's a lot more skills that go into there, like vocabulary, but we package those with critical thinking, and then the rest of the time that we're spending learning concurrently with our children has to be on things that interest them, has to be things that are built on their strengths. I remember a student that, he wasn't in my class, but that I knew at Crestwood Elementary, where I used to work, was the most gifted sculpturist I've ever seen in my life. He just could build the most amazing sculptures. So how could we use sculptures, which is something he spent a lot of time at home doing, for him to demonstrate his knowledge? How do we use that love they have for the world for them to feel connected and feel empowered by their strengths to shift and share their talents? So I think that when teachers have more of that information, what are your goals and what are your child's specific strengths or interests? And can you incorporate that a little bit into what you're teaching? Or my child is really motivated when you do blank. And so I think it's just opening up the communication, especially in a lot of Title I schools. We don't have a whole lot of that parent-initiated conversation, but it doesn't mean that it's not welcomed. It certainly is.
No, I think those are really good tips. I know also as a mom, I always have the best relationships with the teachers who I feel like get my kid. When I know that you see my child as an individual with their strengths and weaknesses and quirks and some of those habits that are great, but some that probably drive us all nuts because that's human, then it's so much easier for me to have those authentic conversations and share, I'm concerned about this. I don't know what's happening with that. I want them. And then again, to have the focus be on acquiring knowledge and learning versus did they turn in this assignment, or what was the grade on this test? And I think that this, there's a lot of things that are difficult about the pandemic, but I hope that that is one of our lessons, is that we focus more on what is really learning versus just saying that we got an A on something, because I'm not sure that serves kids in the same, well, I know it doesn't serve kids in the same way. We are low on time, but I could talk to you for a really long time. But I wanted to end with a question that you've touched on. And I think it would be a good wrap-up one. When it comes to building these partnerships between families and educators, why do our intentions matter? And how can we be more aware of the intentions that we as individuals bring, and how that influences the outcome of the partnership?
Yes, intentions matter, and our intentions are so much more profound than I think we realize sometimes. I do a lot of work on equity and a lot of work on what a lot of people call asset mindset for students. So we see their linguistic capabilities as an asset. We see their cultural and racial attributions as assets. We see their informal education as assets. I think a lot of educators have to do the work of doing that asset building framework in their personal and professional lives. So sometimes if we haven't done that work in our personal lives, it seeps into our professional life. So you may have the best intentions when you're asking a family to do A, but if we haven't identified what the mutual cultural gap or linguistic gaps or understanding gaps are, then it's always one way. So we have to think about ourselves and how we view things and ask ourselves, am I using something called like a normative lens, meaning that this is normal and anything outside of this is abnormal, and it's categorized and it's sometimes subpar. So a lot of the times I think in this country overall, we think that English is normal, or a family with one dad and one mom is normal, or X, Y, and Z is normal. And I think that all that does is divide kids and push kids to the side and families to the side. When we break that normative assessment and we just say, things can be normal to me because I understand them a certain way, or because my experience is a certain way, but we don't place value on different people's experiences, we are open to it, then our intentions will shine through. A lot of the times, and I've seen this firsthand more times than I'd like to remember, is a teacher may not understand how their intentions aren't translated because of some of that bias. And so families feel it right away, kids feel it right away, if we don't have that deep-rooted humanistic respect for the other person that we're working with, and that we're accepting the person for wherever they may be in their life, because that's where they are. And if my role, it's more than a job, if my role is to help your child develop into the best learner they can be, the best peer they can be, then my job is to meet you and your child exactly where you are. And doing that with a lot of empathy, with a lot of open heart. And that's why I think it's so important to have teachers who see themselves reflected in the populations that they teach. Because the more we see ourselves reflected in the population that we teach, the more empathy we have, the more understanding that we have for families and the hardship that sometimes, well, right now, the hardship all families are facing.
Yeah.
There's not one family who's not facing.
It's universal. It's different. It goes back to that same thing, that there's so many different experiences, but there is the universality of the challenges that are being faced. And sometimes I think you talked about that norming lens. I think sometimes we put on that lens of this is my situation and forget how so many other people are impacted. It looks different, but it's still a big impact on their life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I hope that answers your question about intentionality, because right now, I think where we are in terms of understanding our country's racial identity, in terms of racial practices between groups who are normally and historically marginalized. It's a pivotal moment for us to engage our young people, for us to lead by example. Okay, we've made a lot of mistakes. We're going to find the root cause of this mistake, and we're going to use your expertise as children, as people who have big hearts, to change this. And we can start doing this today. And so its intention is so important when we build around it holistically, when we build around the community, when our schools are open and talking about this, and when we are open to families sharing with us their frustrations. I think listening is one of the biggest and most important things educators can do, is just listen to families. So again, we have to build the relationships so that people feel trusting in having those conversations with us. But that's why I was so excited to do this with you today, Rebecca, because I love the opportunity to encourage families to start that conversation if they happen to find themselves in an educational situation where that conversation hasn't been started.
Definitely. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up? I could sit here for a really long time, but recognize everybody's screen time is more precious these days, since it feels like we're on these a lot.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work that Nevada PTA is doing. You know, it's really courageous when organizations see, you know, areas of need. You know, I'm a big fan of Mr. Rogers, and he always talks about, you know, during times of trouble, look for the helpers.
Helpers.
Uh-huh. And so they're like our bright points, right? But we also need to shed light on what doesn't have enough light. And so I really admire organizations like the PTA who have set ambitious goals about rewriting their vision to be able to do those four eyes. I think those four eyes are tremendous. And so I just have a lot of gratitude for the work you do and the work that the Nevada PTA does for our state and our children.
Awesome. Well, thank you. You joined us for a town hall earlier this year, so when you got named as the Teacher of the Year, I very quickly understood why. But your passion and your love for kids is just so clear in everything you talk about. And so thank you for representing our state so well this year as the Nevada Teacher of the Year, and congratulations on that. And thank you for joining us tonight to talk about this important issue. And we look forward to hopefully having some more conversations before you're done, because like I said, I could talk for a lot longer. But thank you so much for being with us and sharing this for all of our members to listen to.
Thank you all so much for listening and participating, and thank you, Rebecca, for organizing it.